I'm Nina Woodsum. I'm a graduate worker in the history department at Columbia University, and I'm going to introduce our last panel, which is migrant workers and racialized labor. We have Tyler Jackson Rogers, who will be giving a paper called The Work of Indigenous Enslavement in Settler Colonial New England. Tyler is a PhD candidate in American Studies at Yale University, where he is also pursuing the certificate in women's gender and sexuality studies. Tyler's scholarship explores the relationship between slavery and settler colonialism in early colonial America, with an emphasis on questions of indigeneity, gender, and archival production. His dissertation project, tentatively titled Visible Through Violence, considers the enslavement of indigenous people in settler colonial New England, with a focus on how and why particular stories of slavery emerge in documentary records. Adrian Smith, who is giving a paper, A Political Economy of Socio-Legality in Settler Colonial Canada, is assistant professor at Carleton University in the Department of Law and Legal Studies. He's cross-appointed to the Institute of Political Economy, and his research interests include labor studies and the global economy, migration, the political economy of development, social movements, and visual legal studies. All of his work is situated within an anti-oppression framework with an emphasis on anti-racism and anti-colonialism. And finally, we have Samantha Spady, who is giving a paper, Limits to Labor Solidarity in Alberta's Oil Patch, Nationalism, Race, and Belonging. She is a third-year PhD student in social justice education at OISE, University of Toronto. Originally from Treaty 8 land in northern Alberta, she now lives, works, and organizes in Toronto, territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat nations. And her research is on settler labor in the tar sands, and it examines the makings of white masculinities through work in extractive industries and the implications this has for anti-colonial pedagogy and organizing. And just a few quick announcements before we start. Unfortunately, Leanne Simpson's reading tonight has been canceled. And I also wanted to let everyone know that on the 7th floor, there are gender-neutral bathrooms. So let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. To begin, I first want to acknowledge the Lenni Lenape peoples on whose traditional homelands we meet today. I extend my gratitude to my fellow presenters, the symposium organizers, and to all of you here in person and online for joining us to participate in this day of critical conversation. For the next few minutes, I will share a portion of my ongoing dissertation project, which examines histories of enslaved indigenous people in early colonial America. My larger project and my talk this afternoon are animated by a central question, which is, how might we write histories of indigenous enslavement both through and against settler colonial archives? This presentation centers the stories of bound indigenous women in settler colonial New England, interrogating the representational logics that render their lives visible at the gendered nexus of slavery and settler colonialism. In this sense, I contend that the work of indigenous enslavement in settler colonial New England is both material and epistemological. Enslavement has served as a settler technology of violence against both indigenous bodies and indigenous histories. Two very good stills, one that holds near 3 barrels, the other better than half a barrel, to be sold on reasonable terms. And an Indian girl, aged about 16 years, to be sold. Inquire at the post office. Published in the Boston Newsletter on June 30th, 1712, this newspaper advertisement announces the sale of distillery equipment alongside the sale of a young indigenous woman. In its terse portrayal of a person as property, this notice lends a lengthier and more detailed description to the stills than to the Indian girl. The anonymous author of this advertisement elaborates the quality and volume of the distillery equipment up for sale while revealing relatively little about the person, quote, to be sold, aside from descriptors of race, gender, and age. Tellingly, this announcement does not explicitly label this Indian girl as a slave or a servant. That she is to be sold sufficiently implies that she has been rendered as chattel. Here she seems to be almost an afterthought, rendered nameless and without a story to explain how she came to be up for sale in early 18th century New England. This advertisement, in its banal acknowledgement of Indigenous enslavement and its simultaneous silencing of enslaved Indigenous persons' voice, is emblematic of the logics that shape the interwoven archives of slavery and settler colonialism in early colonial America. Interpreting the voices of enslaved and colonized peoples through documents created largely by enslavers and colonizers remains, at best, a methodological conundrum, and at worst, an epistemological aporia. As Narragansett elder and historian Dawn Dove theorizes, the documents produced and preserved by settler colonial societies are, quote, lies and half-truths, unquote, which distort Indigenous voices and subjectivities through myriad mediations of colonial knowledge production. How then might we attempt to write histories of enslaved Indigenous people enmeshed in the corporeal and ideological violences wrought by slavery and settler colonialism? In other words, what kinds of physical and discursive work do settler colonial archives perform in shaping our understanding of such stories? Under what circumstances do enslaved Indigenous women, such as this Indian girl aged about 16 years to be sold, become archivally visible? And what does that say more broadly about the settler colonial logics of historical legibility? Within the context of New England, I define colonial archives as sites of knowledge production implicated in settler aggression against Indigenous peoples. Such aggression includes, but certainly is not limited to, land dispossession, enslavement, war, missionization, incarceration, and genocide. Colonial archives operate across various, often overlapping registers of representation, which might be textual, visual, sonic, affective, performative, spatial, as well as embodied. Following Patrick Wolf's framing of settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, colonial archives cannot be relegated solely to a past era. Rather, they continue to be produced in our present moment through ongoing acts of settler occupation and Indigenous dispossession. To further extend Wolf's terminology, colonial archives structure the epistemological contours of how we understand New England's history, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries. Colonial documents, such as this newspaper advertisement, thus transcend a single event of textual creation, reverberating through time to shape the ways in which we interpret the past and the present. I wish I could begin this presentation from the perspective of this Indian girl. I wish I could call her by her name. I wish I could contend with the complexities of her thoughts and actions. To do so would be to center her as a speaking subject, but to do so would also be to impose my own imaginings as enticed by this essentially violent document. By instead grappling with the mediations and erasures of such sources, we can expose the fundamental flaws of settler colonial knowledge production. Informed by Audra Simpson's theorization of ethnographic refusal as a way to understand the ways in which Indigenous subjects turn away from colonial regimes of recognition and knowledge production, I wonder if and how we might pursue a critical method of historiographic refusal. In other words, what would it mean to refuse the terms of historical legibility engendered by colonial archives? In northeastern Algonquian homelands, colonized as New England, the settler practice of enslaving Indigenous peoples began on a large scale in 1637, when colonial officials sold survivors of the Pequot War into slavery. Many enslaved Pequot people were exported elsewhere, particularly to the Caribbean, but others remained in New England to work on the farms and in the homes of settlers. Lacking the legal justification to enslave those who were not prisoners of war, colonists also sentenced Indigenous people to various forms of involuntary servitude as punishment for debt and petty crimes, a practice described by historian Margaret Newell as judicial enslavement. Yet the vulnerability of settler colonial power during the mid-17th century inhibited the widespread practice of Indigenous enslavement, as settlers sought Indigenous allies within military conflicts, and also as Indigenous communities retained much of the land and resources necessary to resist their own exploitation within the colonial labor market. Practices of Indigenous enslavement continued throughout New England over the next 4 decades in the 1700s, leading up to Metacom's Rebellion, also known as King Philip's War. Following this deadly conflict in the 1670s, colonists again sold many Indigenous prisoners of war into bondage locally and diasporically across the Atlantic world. In the years following Metacom's Rebellion, New England settler colonists coerced Indigenous peoples into forms of unfree labor, not as prisoners of war, but as the result of economic dispossession caused by the seizure of land and resources. Even though New England colonial legislatures often passed legal statutes to protect Indigenous peoples, protect in scare quotes, from these practices, coerced servitude continued well into the 18th and early 19th centuries. In the 18th century, colonial officials in New London, Connecticut publicly murdered 2 enslaved Pequot women, the first in 1738 and the second in 1786. If you remember anything from my talk today, I want you to remember their names: Catherine Garrett and Hannah Accouche. While their deaths are separated by nearly half a century, these 2 women are intimately connected by a lethal archival logic. Rendered visible through violence, enslaved Indigenous women are never so present in the archives of settler colonial New England as when surrounded by death. Convicted of murder by colonial courts, both Garrett and Accouche were publicly executed by hanging. The months before and after these executions incited a frenzy of colonial archival production. Newspaper reporters and court clerks eagerly recorded stories related to the Garrett and Accouche cases. Colonial church pastors penned, performed, and published lengthy sermons on the occasion of each execution. And these are the 2 frontispieces for these execution sermons here. Garrett, accused of murdering her newborn child, and Accouche, accused of murdering a young white girl, thus persist in these documents beyond the brief mention afforded by a newspaper advertisement. They emerge not as an anonymous Indian girl, but as highly visible and named murderers. Kill, murder, execute. These words all signify violent death, and yet they are each imbued with distinct connotations. Colonial officials deemed Garrett and Accouche to be guilty of murder, but described their ensuing death sentences as executions. The difference lay not in the act of killing, but in ideas of who might be the proper and improper agents of killing. For an Indigenous woman to kill was imagined as a crime, but for a colonial court to kill was imagined as justice. The discursive disparity between murder and execute thus has enduring implications for how we understand the histories of these 2 women, rendered visible by colonial archives as both the killers and the killed. What then are we to do with these documents? The stories that these sources tell provide an ostensible glimpse into the worlds of 2 Indigenous women in 18th century Connecticut, gesturing towards the broader systems of colonial servitude and bondage in which they lived and died. Yet to merely rehearse the renderings of Garrett and Accouche proffered by colonial archives is perhaps too facile a method. Such a recuperative impulse risks reinscribing colonial archives as extractive sites, which provide the fragments for narrating Indigenous histories. To construct a positivist narrative from these fragments is to elide the mediations, distortions, and silences central to the production of colonial archives. Engaging this tension between historiographic recovery and historiographic refusal, how might we think about Garrett and Accouche at the gendered archival nexus of slavery and settler colonialism? So for the remaining piece of my presentation, in a longer version of this, I walk through a close reading of both of these cases. I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the Accouche case specifically and thinking about some of the problems that interpreting these sources presents us with. In 1774, Hannah Accouche was born in Groton, Connecticut, to a Pequot mother and a father of African descent. According to the account of Accouche's life written by Pastor Henry Channing in his execution sermon, Accouche's mother was an alcoholic and Accouche's father was absent from her life. At a young age, Accouche was bound to work in a white household in New London. On the morning of July 21st, 1786, the dead body of Eunice Bowles, a 6-year-old white girl, was found on the road leading from New London to Norwich. Based on an investigation of Bowles' body, colonial officials concluded that she had been murdered. Believing that Accouche had a motive, members of the community repeatedly questioned Accouche and got her to confess to the murder the day after it occurred. She was incarcerated in the New London County Jail with a trial set for September. On October 3rd, 1786, the 12-year-old Accouche was found guilty of murder by a grand jury and sentenced to death by hanging. And I think it's really important to think about this as this is a 12-year-old girl, and this remains remembered in many instances as the youngest person ever executed in the United States. This is in the infancy of the United States early republic era. So it's interesting to think about that connection here, that the youngest person ever executed was an enslaved Indigenous girl. On December 20th, 1786, Henry Channing preached his execution sermon and Accouche was then hanged. At the end of his sermon, Channing writes that on the gallows, Accouche, quote, thanked the sheriff for his kindness to her, and then passed into that state which never ends, unquote. How might we respond to the notion that Accouche thanked her killers during the final moments of her life? Perhaps having been repeatedly inculcated with Christian doctrines of violent retribution, did she actually believe that she deserved to die? Alternately, could this have been an adroit effort to perform penance for her prosecutors, hoping that they might finally forgive her supposed sins and let her live? Or is it possible that Accouche no longer wished to live, preferring death to a life of servitude and captivity? Even more fundamentally, how are we to know whether Accouche actually did thank her killers, or whether this was a fictionalized flourish inserted by the sermon's author? To some extent, such questions of voice and subjectivity are unanswerable, lying at the limits of what colonial archives can reveal about the life and death of Hannah Accouche. In seeking to write Indigenous histories both through and against settler colonial archives, we encounter a series of shrouded figures. There is an Indian girl aged about 16 years to be sold in 1712 Boston. And there are Catherine Garrett and Hannah Accouche, two women whose names we come to know at the violent archival nexus of slavery and settler colonialism. At the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, owned and operated by the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation of Southeastern Connecticut, an exhibit titled Pequots in the Colonial World memorializes the life and death of Hannah Accouche. Using a mannequin modeled after the likeness of a present-day Indigenous woman, this tableau imagines a moment in which Accouche performed the daily tasks of a bound laborer in 18th century Connecticut. Wearing faded and tattered clothes, she wrings a cloth over a bucket as she kneels to wash the floor of her master's house. Her eyes downcast and her lips pursed, she seems to be deep in reflection, though unlikely to vocalize her thoughts. Again, her voice remains beyond grasp. Perhaps we cannot see the world through her eyes, but only look over her shoulder. But what exactly do we see when we look over her shoulder? We see the work of Indigenous enslavement in settler colonial New England, both in the literal labor that unfree Indigenous women performed and in the epistemological labor that colonial archives perform in rendering Accouche's life and death visible through violence. We see broader histories of slavery and settler colonialism. We see our own shadows, always present in the stories we tell about the past. And hopefully, we see an urgent need to fully recognize, resist, and refuse the work of settler colonialism in enacting violence upon Indigenous peoples and Indigenous histories. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and share some of my work with you. And I'm just getting ready to think through and embark on my field work. So it's been really wonderful to hear from all of you. And it's definitely been pushing my own thoughts forward. So I'm just going to jump right in. My paper's entitled Limits to Labor Solidarity in Alberta's Oil Patch, Nationalism, Race, and Belonging. And in this presentation, I examine how practices of labor have become a way for white settlers in northern Alberta's extractive oil industry to borrow from Nicholas Blomley, enact their claim to land. Or put another way, in what Shona Jackson has called in a very different context, labor acting as a technique of settler belonging. Labor is simultaneously about settler belonging and about creating a new story for the settler-invader population, one that tells settlers that they have earned their place on stolen lands through their hard work. I look specifically to white settlers to understand how the role of both race in the white nation, as well as the practice of settlement, operate in this context, particularly as I draw from Leslie Thielen Wilson's extension of Patrick Wolf's argument on the centrality of land for the settler colonial project. Thielen Wilson argues that, quote, without understanding how the primary motive for elimination is simultaneously about race as it is about land, we cannot truly understand the ongoing nature of settler colonialism, end quote. So today I want to discuss how labor is working to legitimize the settler nation state and how the racialized implications of this may have for our considerations on what an anti-colonial labor solidarity may look like, especially in zones of resource extraction. So on the screen is a map of the province of Alberta in Western Canada, and I look specifically to the oil industry in Northern Alberta, which you've all likely heard of as the tar sands. My research is focused on Fort McMurray, which is located in the northeast corner of the province, and this land is Treaty 8 land, which only sort of includes the top part of the province, but also includes much more land to the northeast and west of this area, and also is the territories of many Cree, Dene, and Métis nations. So historically, this region was symbolically created as a northern frontier, specifically a northern mineral and resource frontier. And following the work of Richard Phillips and Richard Slotkin, the creation of a frontier served both symbolic and material purposes. Symbolically, this land would harden and regenerate the white race to a new rigor and new racial purity, as the white race was thought to be growing soft and degenerate in the modern urban life of the late 19th century. Materially, however, this frontier also had the ability to create wealth for the enterprising settler, and functioned as a way to temporarily address the scarcity and inequality created by capitalism and Europe in the already settled regions of southern Canada. So spaces like Northern Alberta became a part of what's been sort of termed as the Canadian hinterland. Following the work of Harold Innis, the hinterland provided the staples for the Canadian economy, raw resources for export. And this idea is that the hinterland then remained less industrially developed than central Canada and other export centers. This space was more rural, pristine, and sort of was also then became in a dependent relationship to the center. However, this relationship of dependence also placed the hinterland as the racial, moral heart of the nation. These hinterland spaces created in particular a hinterland masculinity that served to define the Canadian nation in a way that continues to fuel white supremacist mythology of the nation today. That is, the myth of the pioneer who labored to build the nation and who, because of his economic reliance on industries that came from the land, and also that these industries could be dangerous and physically demanding, I'm thinking in particular farming, logging, mining, and fishing, that it is through this labor in these industries that they became the true national subject. Those who had mixed their labor with the land in the Lockean fashion of original appropriation in order to become the true and legitimate Canadian subject. The very idea of Canada's hinterland heartland reflects this imagined white nation. And to clarify, I'm describing the imagined space of the hinterland as one that is producing the idea of a white Canadian racial imaginary, and not what this space looks like demographically. In reality, these spaces are not homogeneous, and they depend upon particular forms of racialized migrant labor, like the temporary foreign worker program, among others, and also include the Indigenous people who have never left. What I am describing here is how these spaces are constructed as the white heartland of Canada, and a heartland that was built through the so-called brawn and might of white men, which we sort of see on the slide here. I now turn to the recent drop in oil prices that have created the current crisis in Alberta. Unemployment and alongside it, suicide and domestic violence have all spiked as oil has dropped, suggesting that this crisis is also one of white masculinity, and how this is operating in this particular moment. Yet the drop in oil prices is not the only reason for the oil industry's hardship. International criticism, environmental and Indigenous resistance on both sides of the border, as well as Obama's rejection of the Keystone Pipeline, have all been important moments. They have caused the oil industry to scramble to redefine themselves as a source of Canadian nationalism. Oil is no longer this industry that will always and should always exist, and as a result, they've had to rework their image. Dozens of so-called grassroots campaigns have sprung up, predominantly founded and funded by petroleum producers and other industry-run organizations. However, the names of these campaigns display just how centrally the nation figures in this discourse. We have British Columbians for Prosperity, Energy Citizens, Pipeline Action, and the subject of this presentation, Canada Action. In particular, their campaign that is I Love the Oil Sands or I Heart Oil Sands. So this is an infographic from Canada Action's campaign, And I examined this particular campaign in detail for a few reasons. As this group self-identifies as a type of grassroots organization, it's less than obvious that it's actually run by industry. And I think this represents a kind of shift in how it's revealing the practices of nation-making through extractive labor that are represented in this particular way of presenting themselves. And particularly that this campaign depends upon this idea that there's a national groundswell for pipelines and oil, and they sort of represent themselves as this pulse of the nation that is also about oil development. Infographics and memes are a central part of their campaign. They're widely shared on Facebook, especially in Fort McMurray in Alberta, and are depicting this so-called new consensus on the issue. So just to describe this image, it's a map of the world listing oil producers and where they rank on a global corruption scale. Canada, according to the study, being far less corrupt than many other oil-producing countries. We also have this one. It's reiterating this idea of Canada the good. The slide reads, quote, "Alberta is a world leader in greenhouse gas emissions on oil. Even the US has not met Alberta's standards. Take action for Canada's future," end quote. This one is another map of the world. This one discussing the reputation of certain oil-producing countries on freedom of the press. And it's, again, this comparison to the unethical, the corrupt, and oppressive petrostates that we know to be, or they know to be, Angola, Venezuela, and of course, everyone's favorite, Saudi Arabia. This one is calling for pipelines so that Canadian oil refineries don't have to refine Saudi oil. This calls upon the knowledge of how bad these countries are and is erasing what goes on here that is just as violent, and not to mention the very obvious xenophobia and racism that this is, again, reproducing. But these ethical oil arguments are not new. We've seen this before. This next slide, however, shows a shift, presenting the idea of building the nation through resource extraction. The image is a quote of an environmental scientist who says, quote, "Canadian oil supports Canadian jobs and Canadian institutions," end quote. So this is offering a type of welfare state to those who may see the ethical oil arguments for what they are, racist, and depends upon a more liberal idea of celebrating Canada's so-called progress, our progressive policies, our public health care, but also how all of this progress ultimately depends upon natural resource development. This slide here shows a picture of New Brunswick Premier Brian Gallant arguing that, quote, "Energy East pipeline is good for the nation," end quote. New Brunswick is also one of the more economically depressed regions of the country, and they really do rely on interprovincial migration to the oil patch for remittances sent home by their workers. And I think this role, the role that the industry has played for the national economy more largely, makes its current crisis not simply one that's confined to a regional problem or just the oil-producing provinces. As traditionally masculine labor in fisheries, logging, and auto manufacturing in southern Ontario has bottomed out over the past 2 decades, migration to the oil patch has functioned to offer these predominantly white men the manual labor and physically demanding jobs with high salaries that are underpinning this type of hegemonic masculinity that is being forged through one's employment. That oil could sustain all those who were unemployed and downtrodden exalts the industry further, and we can see this idea again reiterated, but for Aboriginal populations, proclaiming that natural resources ought to be celebrated for also employing Aboriginal people. And it's not hard to read this a little bit closer and see what it's doing, that the industry is rewarding itself for doing something about the Aboriginal problem, and then it can even help the population that Canadians are always complaining about. Erasing the violence and dispossession that removes other ways of supporting and sustaining life on this land, jobs in the oil industry are touted as the solution, a perfect neoliberal fix. Furthermore, this erases what the oil industry is doing downstream. The Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation has experienced incredibly high rates of very rare and aggressive cancers, And these cancers have been formally dismissed as not related to tar sand development. However, it is Indigenous resistance that has been a crucial opponent to the oil industry in not just northern Alberta, but across the continent. It is repeatedly Indigenous peoples who are opposing and actually stopping pipeline development. And I don't think you can read the dismissal of their cancers without taking that resistance into account. However, now that oil has dropped so significantly, white anger is focused more on government and less explicitly on the Indigenous resistance and environmental criticism that was once dominating the conversation when oil was high and profitable. So what happens when the profitability of land, what happens when the profitability of land and resource extraction suddenly comes under threat from the very economic processes that make it possible and profitable in the first place? As the practices that secured white masculinity slowly fall apart, we are predictably seeing violence erupt. Whether through the self-harm I mentioned before, with increasing rates of suicide among white unemployed men, but also gendered violence, as domestic violence was calculated to have shot upwards of 40% in the first year of the economic slowdown, we have a serious problem when this segment of the population becomes vulnerable. The threat of violence spilling outward onto the bodies of racialized and Indigenous peoples can't be dismissed as exaggeration. When labor is centrally forming settler belonging and functioning as a mode of settler practice, what are the next steps for building through and with this disenfranchisement? Blue-green alliances have been touted as one potential solution to the crisis. We see the newly formed Earth and Iron campaign, where this image was taken from, that calls for support to train oil industry workers to instead work in renewable energy sectors. And there has also been a concerted effort by some labor leaders in the region to start the conversation about what oil workers will do in the near climate change future. However, blue-green alliances are not blue, green, and red. We only have to look to how mainstream environmental movements have sidelined the very Indigenous land defense movements that are actually stopping development. Furthermore, there remains the goal of prioritizing settler economic futures. This discussion is stalled on jobs and is unable to get to justice. Though we should not be surprised by these moves, they reflect how the crisis produces the further entitlement and entrenchment of extractive labor. And with respect to pipelines, climate change, and tar sands, it is also about whose lives are deemed acceptable collateral damage. To conclude, I want to talk very briefly about what a politics of anti-colonial harm reduction may look like. I propose harm reduction as opposed to solidarity or shared struggle, given the incommensurability between a decolonial future and one of settler futurity that Eve Chuck and Kay Wayne Yang have described. They argue that, quote, the opportunities for solidarity lie in what is incommensurable rather than what is common, end quote. This challenges us to rethink what enacting solidarity may look like, and I draw on abolitionist William Wilberforce's solution to ending slavery for inspiration. His solution was simply to quit stealing. We need to quit stealing, and we need to start dealing with the fragility that entrenches practices that make stealing commonplace. This may look like challenging hegemonic masculinity and heteropatriarchy in our communities of white settlers, but also building supports to channel their anxiety away from violent expressions of it. Above all, this looks like Above all, this looks like doing the work to keep angry white settler populations out of the way of Indigenous people who are putting forward alternative ways of being on these lands, and most significantly, defending them against further theft. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that both Tyler and Sam touched on, and I think in particular you'll see the story I'm about to engage in, if I can call it a story, links very nicely to some of the questions or the examples that Sam just sort of worked through. So my work that I'm going to talk about today is on the relationship between migrant labor regulation and settler colonial capitalism. And here I'm talking specifically about temporary migrant labor and specifically agricultural workers or farm labor deployed in Ontario, Canada, through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, the SOP, which is a program quite similar to the H-2A program here in the States. And I'm interested in the sort of law and regulation, not simply as formal rules, but in fact as practices, and how ordinary people actually enact law, carry out law on a daily basis. And in this sense, I think it's interesting to link it with settler colonialism. And often we talk about settler colonialism as territoriality, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. Of course, you all know the references. But I think this detracts from our understanding of how work and labor are central to territoriality. And I think ultimately, if you take anything from this talk, it's that I'm trying not to dichotomize territory and labor and see them as both operating always together. So when we look at work and labor, we also should see law. We should see that in that work, in that labor, we see ordinary people enacting law, and in that maintaining settler colonial capitalism. And I want to talk about the complexities of that. So my core claim is that the work of settler colonial displacement is legal work. Socio-spatial practices of ordinary people, or what I call here socio-legality, or perhaps more aptly, material legality, right? I'm trying to get a material concept of law going here. Those socio-spatial practices of ordinary people forms the content of what we typically refer to as law and legality. And I'm focused here on the context of agro-extractivism. So the paper that I've worked on is an amalgam of other papers. So in it, I open with the discussion of a housing dispute, a migrant housing dispute that occurred in southwestern Ontario. And I use it as a way to dig into the complexities of these ideas that I have. So in late 2011, as I said, in southwestern Ontario, between basically Detroit and Toronto, sort of halfway in between, Norfolk Select Potato Company made an offer for purchase of an abandoned school building to convert it into housing for migrant workers employed through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. Migrant worker bunkhouses, as they're called in the regulatory regime, are typically located on or near the employing farm facilities. In the proposal, the workers would be housed some distance away from the farm. And so this required, and in this tiny community called Woodsum Center, as I say, Woodsum Center, I don't know if I've said it yet, but Woodsum Center is in what's called Norfolk County in southwestern Ontario on the north shore of Lake Erie. So Norfolk Potato's offer was made conditional on a Norfolk County zoning bylaw amendment, which, according to the provisions of Ontario's Planning Act, can only be taken by the municipal council after a public consultation, including a notice period, an opportunity to provide comments, and a public meeting on the application. So in a paper I've written called The Bunkhouse Rules, I examined the written responses of the Woodsum Center residents, overwhelmingly against this proposal. As one resident put it in the written submission, and it seems to me that these words capture the sentiments of others, there is no way for the farmers who have made this application to monitor and supervise the amount of men proposed to be housed on this site if they are not there. It has absolutely nothing to do with the race of these men. They could be white or green with purple spots. That many men housed in that manner, away from their families, is asking for trouble which our little hamlet should not be responsible for, as it wasn't us who asked for them to be housed there, end quote. So, I mean, around these parts, that's not actually a very shocking or jarring framing. It shouldn't be in the Canadian context either, but because of the mythology surrounding the Canadian state, it happens to be. Of course, Canada has no history of colonialism, said our former Prime Minister. and we have all of the great things that all of the great powers have, but none of the problems. That's more or less a direct quote from our last Prime Minister. So here then, this quote from this resident is clearly rehearsing the well-worn racist colonial tropes about the need for, supervision of racialized laboring bodies by their bosses, about the hypersexual proclivities of their workers. There's a number of references to the threatening being of these workers, predominantly men, but not only men. I should say these workers are coming predominantly from the Caribbean since mid-1960s, and there's been a shift towards sort of Mexican workers as well under this program. So clearly the bunkhouse example, I'm not sort of invoking it just for the sort of, progressive shock and awe, I can't believe this is happening kind of thing. I wanted to dig deeper, and I think it's an example here that exposes the unquestioned assumption of entitlement of settlers to be present and even more to make decisions on who gets to belong, right? And here then it's a claim about authority, legitimate authority, which I see as something to do with politics and law. And this claim of authority hinges on the very deployment of racialized migrant farm labor in this context. The entitlement is a product, this sense of entitlement that the Wyndham Center settlers have is a product of centuries of the legal fiction of Canada and Canada's claim to a legitimate authority. So the conventional point of departure for the study of law and legality in Canada remains an acceptance of this legitimate authority of the Canadian state and its law. Simply put, Canada is taken for granted. But what would it mean to trouble, destabilize, or downright unsettle this foundational assumption, especially given that it informs not only the study of law, but the Canadian political economy tradition, which I've been working in myself? After all, political and legal shifts, twists, and turns notwithstanding, there's a great deal troubling about Canada as it pertains to the foundational relations with Indigenous peoples, and the troubles persist with respect to relations with so-called foreign, non-resident, and resident peoples. Given this stubborn persistence, Canada's taken-for-granted existence requires a great deal of work. So the ensuing analysis addresses the work and workings of Canada as a settler colonial capitalist entity, with an emphasis on the role of law and legality, that is, with a view to the socio-spatial practices, that is, the work and labor of ordinary people in everyday life, or what, as I said already, I call socio-legality or material legality. A turn to the emergent field of settler colonial studies and the subdisciplinary engagements with law offers a helpful but ultimately circumscribed revision. Settler colonial studies rightly calls for an interrogation of the colonial relation, but in ways which seemingly downplay or neglect the insights of the capital relation and its core productive and social reproductive dimensions understood in gendered and racialized class terms, and to the necessity of an explanatory framework forged on the unity of the whole, what I see as the raison d'etre of political economy critique. So socio-legality, which takes on general and specific understandings and configurations within a given context, emerges out of socio-spatial practices undertaken not just by official actors, lawyers, judges, and their activity profoundly interventions, such as the work of course, Patrick Wolf, we've talked a lot about today, and quite importantly, enforce a sharp division or distinction between colonial and settler colonial formations, famously characterizing settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. Wolf's account takes settler colonial structure as, and I'm quoting, not primarily established to extract surplus value from Indigenous labor, but for displacing Indigenous peoples from or replacing them on the land. In contrast to colonialism's dependence on native labor, therefore, settler colonialism is first and foremost a territorial project that prioritizes not extracting an economic surplus from mixing their labor with it, but displacement and replacement of natives on a given land, end quote. Territoriality on this account forms, in Wolf's words, settler colonialism's specific irreducible element. So the claim that territoriality and displacement replacement drive settler colonialism has its own displacement and replacement effect. I posit that labor and work forms an integral yet displaced dimension of the terrain of analysis and struggle. Territoriality is not a thing, but rather an actionable spatial and legal claim of authority set within the relations of private property, dispossession, commodification, and exploitation, and carried out through socio-spatial practices. The displacement and replacement effect is evident in several respects. A common approach is to provisionally delay or forestall the question of labor. So seminal efforts such as Cole Harris's privileged land dispossession in the first instance, treating land as the, in quotations, principal resource, but then turn around and bring labor in through the back door. As Harris almost immediately goes on to note, the initial ability to dispossess rested primarily on physical power and the supporting infrastructure of the state, end quote. Similarly, to the extent that settler colonialism is characterized as an expropriated land base, driven by settlers' interest in land as livelihood, expropriation and livelihood stand in for processes, practices, and ways of being or living more properly associated with conceptions of labor and work, chiefly social reproduction. Hence, labor and work within the capital relation are too often distant frames in settler colonial accounts. We therefore can trace the displacement of labor and work in leading conceptualizations of settler colonialism. Early conceptualizations of settler colonialism as a total economic force have been replaced by post-colonial and similarly situated theoretical accounts in which, and I'm quoting here, economic categories have disappeared virtually without trace. The jettisoning of work and labor from, again, another quote, bourgeois social thought follows from rejection of the orthodox Marxist view that the dispossession of indigenous peoples from land occurred solely for the purposes of securing surplus labor, and from the now well-entrenched retreat from class analysis, politics, and struggles in the academy and left movements. So I'm not here going to argue, and not in my 2 minutes, going to argue that we should return to orthodox Marxism. In fact, I quite liked the phrase this morning we heard from Sean Kennedy, who called it, I think, settler Marxism, and I agree. We need an anti-racist historical materialist analysis. I'm not sure now that I can do that in 2 minutes, so maybe that's for the best. Following these correctives, we can conceive of work and labor in fundamentally different terms. If pivotal forces driving settler colonialism are primitive accumulation and its continuation as dispossessive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession, then it is crucial to acknowledge that the very practices, processes, and relations of dispossession, of divorcing people from land, of pushing them toward market dependence, and of transforming existing ontologies of lived existence or survival are not only themselves about the creation of capitalist work and labor, but call forth work, labor, and the capital relation. Dispossession is but another more general way of framing the ongoing work and labor of settler colonialism. The work of settler colonialism is the work of displacement and replacement of indigenous peoples on territory which those peoples toiled and dwelled and continue to. Therefore, work, labor, and the capital relation matter to how we characterize settler colonialism and how we conceive of the sites, forms, and aims of resistance to prevailing structural relations and processes. A second point, and perhaps I'll end on this. A second dimension of the displacement and replacement effect relates to law and legality. Displacement owes something to the presumed distinction between socio and legal. The socio-spatial practices of work and labor displaced within characterizations of unfolding settler colonial dispossession necessarily entail the work and labor of claiming and keeping, and these are legal notions. Sociospatial practices unfold with a historically specific and open-ended set of structural relations and processes of settler colonial capitalism. Much of the focus on contemporary capitalism places great emphasis on dispossessive accumulation through fossil fuel and mining-based natural resource extraction or extractivism. Yet agricultural work and labor assumed, and I argue continues to assume, a crucial place within settler colonial capitalist dispossession, especially the claiming and keeping of territory and land and the resources that run with it. Chris Tomlins, the sociolegal historian, discusses the work of early English colonizers in peopling, planting, and keeping mainland North America. Labor was essential to colonizing, notes Tomlins, because labor constructed the means of keeping. Labor transformed the face of the land. And as legal notion, keeping is the process through which law would determine who kept what. The characteristic practices of planting and of agricultural work and labor more broadly proved integral to dispossession and appropriation in law and to the determination of who kept what. Or to put it differently, labor and work are necessary to the legal recognition and expression of private property ownership within settler colonial capitalist social relations. Clearly there's much more to be said, but perhaps I can do that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I have a question for Sam. I was wondering, I know this isn't your specific research area, but I was wondering if you could speak about the intersections between hegemonic masculinities and able-bodiedness that you encountered as you were doing your research.
Is this? Hello? Okay. I really haven't thought through that intersection as much, only sort of peripherally through going through sort of these hinterland masculinity literatures. And there is this very, clear connection between your body's ability to do these sort of strenuous, tough jobs. And so it's the construction of that through one's labor that is making that masculinity. So it's definitely something that's there, but I haven't spent a lot of time thinking through it. But that's a great question, and it is it's very much about the body and very much about the male body and how that is performing and also being created as this identity.
Hello. This is also for Sam. Sorry, other two. I'm really interested in your use of Tuck and Yang's incommensurability as a framework for maybe rejecting solidarity and moving towards contingent collaborations. And you mentioned sort of a settler harm reduction instead of a solidarity model, and I'd just love to hear more about that. Thanks.
So in terms of Tuck and Yang's incommensurability, when I first read that, it seemed to click a lot for me in terms of the conversations I was having with my communities back home in Fort McMurray, and also just my experience, the types of things you hear when you talk about the work you do, right? It's such a foreign and also very felt reaction to challenging these ways that people know themselves. And as I've tried to make the argument, it's so integral to their daily practice of their work, right? So for me, it's been more and more about thinking through, well, what could you do if this becomes, if when you push this, it erupts in violence, right? So the thing that I've sort of been thinking through is this idea of well, then getting them out of the way, or reducing the violent impacts that these populations can have on Indigenous people and people of color, and what that looks like in particular locations, especially in these locations where the whole culture is about work. People go to Fort McMurray to get a job, and if that becomes the sort of like way that you see the world. Yeah, so again, that's kind of a project that I think will become more clear as I do my fieldwork, hopefully, and also as I just keep thinking through it. But I see it as like that's the best we can do at this moment, particularly with the kinds of groups that I'm talking about and thinking through. Thanks.
I will have one last question.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Thank you so much for these papers. My question is particularly for Tyler. You bring up such an excellent question about methodology in terms of studying Indian slavery or Native slavery. And I'm wondering what you feel we can learn from scholars of African American slavery, what we can take from their methodologies and what we should reject as we embark on this subfield of Indian slavery that's becoming bigger and bigger. I guess I'm thinking specifically of Jennifer Morgan's work, who I know you love. How we can learn so much and yet so little from a will, that will just say woman, and what her age is and all of these things. I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Haley. That's an excellent question. I think that this is really important, particularly in thinking about intersections between critical Indigenous studies and Black studies. I think that there can be a danger in certain practices of citation that erase the work of Black scholars, particularly Black feminist scholars, in theorizing these issues about archival violence, thinking about conversations that emerge out of Afro-pessimism. I mean, somebody who I didn't mention explicitly in my talk, but that is all through the footnotes of all of my work and in citation of my work, is Cydia Hartman, who's thinking about these questions of how gender and enslavement converge in these moments, to really leave us with these fragments of knowledge that require critical interrogation and not to accept things at face value that you're reading in these archives. So I think absolutely, in terms of your question, what should we embrace, what should we reject? I don't know if I see it in those kind of either or terms. I think that there's just so much critical interaction that can happen between these fields, and that already is really happening in really excellent ways. And as I think our conversation today in general is thinking through, right, the work of settler colonialism as an analytic for foregrounding dispossession of land as a technology of violence, and as this panel and others before it have thought about how labor intersects with that, right? And so I think that it's not necessarily that work of in Black studies and of Black scholars about slavery should be rejected for its minimal engagement with settler colonialism, but rather that there's really productive conversations that can happen that are already happening, which is really excellent to see. So thank you again for that question.
Thank you.